The night of the 14th of November 1942 began like many others over the restless waters north of Guadalcanal, moonless, silent, and deceptively calm. The sea was a black mirror reflecting nothing, swallowing sound and light alike. To the naked eye, the horizon was emptiness. But deep inside the Combat Information Center of the battleship USS Washington, BB-56, the world looked entirely different. On the glowing green screens of the SG surface search radar, faint blips began to appear. One, then another, then a cluster. Each blip pulsed rhythmically with every sweep of the antenna distant, precise, alive. At exactly 2,300 hours, radar operators reported 9 contacts moving south through the darkness, 18,000 yards away. They were Japanese warships, advancing unseen through the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound. To the men of Washington, those radar echoes meant everything. For the first time in naval history, a battleship could track and fight an enemy it could not see. Above deck, the night seemed infinite. No moon, no stars, only the faint hum of turbines beneath their feet and the steady rhythm of the radar antenna turning in the dark. The ship's lookouts peered into nothingness, black sky meeting black sea, but in the radar room, the invisible world was perfectly visible. The SG radar, a new technology installed only months earlier, had transformed the ship's senses. It could detect vessels at ranges that once seemed impossible through fog, rain, and darkness. And paired with the Mark III fire control radar, Washington could not only find targets, but also aim at them with mathematical precision. This was no longer guesswork or dead reckoning. It was science meeting steel. For 16 months, the crew had trained for this moment. Day after day, they had drilled under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee Jr., the quiet Kentuckian who commanded the task force. Lee believed radar would change everything, that a ship could fight blind and still win. His men had come to believe it too, though few had ever seen it tested in real battle. Tonight would be the first time. Out beyond the radar's green glow, 9 Japanese ships were closing the distance. They were powerful vessels, cruisers, and destroyers, escorting a battleship of their own, but they were fighting in the past. They still relied on searchlights, flares, and binoculars to find the enemy. To them, the ocean was still ruled by the human eye. They did not know that an unseen American battleship was watching every move they made. That blindness was about to cost them dearly. For months, the war in the Pacific had been brutal, chaotic, and uncertain. The United States had been reeling since Pearl Harbor, clawing for every inch of progress. Guadalcanal, a small jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain, had become the hinge of the entire Pacific campaign. Whoever controlled its airfield, Henderson Field controlled the sea lanes between America and Australia. The Marines who held that strip of coral and grass had been bombed, shelled, and starved, yet they refused to yield. Every night, Japanese warships crept down from the north to bombard them, and every night the Americans braced for another inferno. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, knew the situation could not continue. A Japanese victory on Guadalcanal would unravel months of sacrifice. Reinforcements had to be stopped. Bombardments had to end. The Marines had to be saved, whatever the cost. And that meant sending in the battleships. But naval doctrine in 1942 was against it. Battleships, once the pride of the fleet, had been demoted to carrier escorts, floating anti-aircraft platforms, as some officers called them. After Pearl Harbor, few believed they could survive modern warfare. Carriers were the new gods of the sea. Battleships were relics of another age. The irony was bitter. The greatest surface warships ever built were being held back, forbidden to do the very thing they were designed for ship-to-ship combat. USS Washington was one of those ships. Commissioned only a year earlier, She was a masterpiece of American engineering, 35,000 tons of armor and firepower, 9 16-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of small cars across 20 miles. She could take punishment and deliver it tenfold, but since her launch, she had never fired her main guns in combat. She had crossed the Atlantic, trained with the British Home Fleet, guarded convoys, and steamed halfway around the world, all without firing a shot in anger. Now, in the darkness off Guadalcanal, that would change. The radar operators aboard Washington worked silently, their faces lit by the ghostly green glow of their screens. Every sweep of the antenna updated the picture. The enemy was closing fast, moving in formation, completely unaware of what waited ahead. In the plotting room, technicians marked each contact on a glass plotting board with grease pencils. Bearings and ranges were called out in calm, clipped tones. Every few seconds, someone updated the course and speed. Washington's Combat Information Center had become a living brain, an organism made of men, machines, and mathematics. Above, on the bridge, Admiral Lee stood motionless beside the ship's captain, Glenn Davis. Lee's thick glasses reflected the faint light of the radar repeaters. He rarely spoke. He didn't need to. Every man aboard knew his orders were simple. Hold course, hold fire, and wait. The Japanese fleet was still invisible. Their lookouts scanned the horizon but saw nothing. They expected no American battleships, only a few destroyers, and perhaps aircraft from Henderson Field. They were overconfident, convinced that the night belonged to them. For years, Japanese training had focused on night combat, on stealth and surprise, on the deadly power of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo. They believed the Americans were clumsy in the dark, blind and slow to react. Tonight, they would discover how wrong they were. On Washington's bridge, tension was a physical thing, a hum in the air, a tightening in every muscle. The men knew what had happened just 3 nights earlier. Admiral Callahan's cruiser force had fought in these same waters and been decimated. The sea still carried oil slicks and wreckage from that disaster. Bodies still floated somewhere out there in the dark. The crew of Washington had read the reports. They knew what failure looked like. Now it was their turn to face the same enemy, but this time with a new weapon. At 18,000 yards, the Japanese ships were still unaware. At 16,000, still nothing. At 14,000, they should have been visible, but the night remained unbroken. At 12,000, the radar image sharpened. The enemy column was holding steady. Still no lights. Still no flares. Still no sign they knew. Range closing, came the report. 10,000 yards. The sound of breathing seemed loud in the silence. A few men whispered prayers. Others stared at the radar scopes, hypnotized by the tiny pulses of green light that represented thousands of lives. The Japanese fleet was now within striking distance. One order from Admiral Lee would unleash the most powerful naval guns in the Pacific, and with them, the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. But Lee didn't give the order. Not yet. He understood something that doctrine never taught. Timing was everything. If he fired now, the Japanese would scatter. They would realize they were being tracked by radar and flee before Washington could cripple them. But if he waited, if he let them come close enough to commit to their attack run on Henderson Field, then they would have no room to escape. So Lee waited, against every instinct, against every lesson drilled into him at the Naval War College. The range dropped. 9,000 yards. 8,000. 500. 8,000. On the radar screen, the Japanese column was now so close that their signals almost overlapped. The operators could hear their own heartbeats. The bridge was utterly still. Admiral Lee turned toward Captain Davis. "We'll take them here," he said quietly. At 2,300 hours, the order was given. Open fire. The night erupted. 9 16-inch guns thundered as one, belching fire and steel into the darkness. The concussion shook the ship from bow to stern. Men's ears rang. The shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, soared invisibly across the night sky, guided not by human eyes but by radar and calculation. 23 seconds later, giant plumes of water rose among the enemy formation. The first salvo missed, but not by much. The Japanese light cruiser Sendai was drenched by towering geysers of water. Her captain shouted orders, unaware that he had just been fired upon by an enemy he could not even see. A second salvo followed faster, more precise. Washington's radar tracked the fall of shot, corrected aim automatically, and fired again. In that moment, modern naval warfare began. That was the night the radars saw first, when a single American battleship proved that technology could conquer darkness, that training could overcome tradition, and that the future of sea combat no longer belonged to the human eye. The battle itself had only just begun, but the revolution was already underway. In the silence between salvos, amid the smoke and echoes, the crew of USS Washington realized what they had become: the first warship in history to fight and strike in total darkness, guided only by the invisible hand of radar. The enemy still could not see them, but Washington could see everything, and that made all the difference. The victory that night was not inevitable. It was born out of desperation, not confidence. Because in 1942, the United States Navy was fighting not only the Japanese Empire, but also its own beliefs. For decades, the Navy's doctrine had revolved around the aircraft carrier. The lessons of Pearl Harbor seemed to prove that battleships were obsolete, great floating relics of a past age, too slow, too vulnerable, too expensive. Every war game, every training manual, every tactical discussion since that terrible morning in December 1941 came to the same conclusion. The carrier was king. Battleships had become servants, not masters reduced to screening duty, protecting the flat-topped carriers from submarines and aircraft. Their 16-inch guns, once symbols of absolute power, now served mostly as decoration. Officers joked bitterly that the battleships existed only to throw up flak while real fighting was done by planes. That belief ran deep. It dictated every decision the Navy made in the South Pacific, including the one that had cost so many lives just 3 nights earlier. In the early hours of the 13th of November 1942, Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan had led Task Force 67, a collection of cruisers and destroyers, into the same waters Washington now prowled. His mission had been to stop a Japanese bombardment group heading for Henderson Field, the airstrip on Guadalcanal that had become the heart of the American defense. Callahan's ships included 2 heavy cruisers, USS San Francisco and USS Portland, the light cruiser Helena, the anti-aircraft cruisers Atlanta and Juno, and 8 destroyers. On paper, it was a formidable force. But it lacked the one thing that could have changed everything: battleships. 2 modern battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, were available in the theater. They were powerful, fast, and fully operational, but they were being held back with the carrier USS Enterprise, the last functional American carrier in the entire South Pacific. The reasoning was simple and wrong. Carriers were too valuable to risk. Battleships existed to protect carriers. Therefore, battleships must not be risked either. It was doctrine masquerading as logic, and it sent hundreds of Americans to their deaths. That night, Callahan's cruisers had sailed into a trap. The Japanese bombardment group they sought to intercept was led by Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, and it was far stronger than anyone in Callahan's task force realized. Abe's formation included 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, along with a heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers. When the 2 forces met in the darkness, it was chaos. The Americans, lacking radar fire control on most ships, had no clear idea where the enemy was. The Japanese, trained for night fighting, opened with searchlights and torpedoes. The ocean erupted in flashes of white and red tracer fire, explosions, and the sudden glare of spotlights slicing through the smoke. At point-blank range, ships blasted each other until they were burning hulks. In the confusion, American ships even fired on one another. The destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson were all lost. The light cruiser Atlanta was torn apart, hit first by Japanese shells, then by friendly fire from San Francisco. Admiral Callahan was killed when a 14-inch shell from Hye struck San Francisco's bridge. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, aboard Atlanta, died the same way. When dawn came, 4 American ships were gone and 2 more were sinking. 706 sailors were dead. The Japanese had lost only 2 destroyers, though Hye, crippled by gunfire, would be sunk later that day by air attack. The cost of ignoring doctrine had been paid in blood. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, read the after-action reports with growing alarm. Guadalcanal had become a nightmare. The Marines on the island were exhausted, low on supplies, and holding by sheer willpower. The Japanese were relentless. Every night, their ships, the Marines called them the Tokyo Express, brought reinforcements and shelled Henderson Field. The airfield was vital. Without it, the Americans would lose the island and perhaps the entire South Pacific. Now, new intelligence made everything worse. Another powerful Japanese task force was on the way, larger than Abe's, and commanded by Admiral Nobutake Kondo, one of Japan's most experienced officers. His flagship would be the battleship Kirishima, sister ship to the Hye. With her came 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their mission was simple: bombard Henderson Field into rubble, then cover the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall. The Marines would be overrun. The first American offensive of the Pacific War would end in catastrophe. Nimitz understood the stakes. He also understood what doctrine said: never risk battleships without carrier support. But his only carrier, Enterprise, was barely holding together, her flight deck still patched with steel plates from the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands 3 weeks earlier. Her air group was depleted, her mechanics working miracles just to keep planes flying. If he kept the battleships back to protect her, the Marines would die. If he sent them forward alone, they might be destroyed, leaving Enterprise defenseless. Every textbook, every lecture he'd ever heard at the Naval War College told him what not to do. But textbooks don't fight wars, men do. The decision Nimitz made next was one of the hardest of the entire Pacific campaign. He ordered Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, to release the battleships. Send them in alone. Let them fight ship to ship. Doctrine be damned. Halsey didn't hesitate. He knew what was at stake. He turned to a man he trusted, a quiet, unassuming Kentuckian with thick glasses and a mind like a gun sight, Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, Jr. Lee was 54 years old, older than most of the fighting admirals now leading the Pacific War. To anyone meeting him for the first time, he didn't look like a warrior. He was short, stocky, and perpetually rumpled, his uniform never quite fitting right. He spoke with a slow Kentucky drawl that made some underestimate him. But behind those calm blue eyes was one of the finest tactical minds in the Navy. Lee's fascination with precision had started long before the war. He had been a marksman of legendary skill, an Olympic champion who had won 5 gold medals, 2 silvers, and a bronze in shooting at the 1920 Antwerp Games. He understood ballistics instinctively: wind, distance, trajectory, deflection, not as numbers, but as rhythm. To him, A 16-inch naval gun was just a very large rifle. The principles were the same. Aim, adjust, and fire until the target disappears. But what truly set Lee apart wasn't just his skill with weapons, it was his understanding of technology. Where other admirals saw radar as a novelty, Lee saw a revolution. He realized it could turn night into day, blindness into vision, confusion into certainty. A ship with radar, properly used, could see through darkness. It could track targets at ranges where the enemy could not even imagine a threat. It could calculate firing solutions faster and more accurately than human spotters. And most importantly, it could allow one ship to dominate an entire battle. For 6 months, Lee had been preparing for exactly this. He had redesigned Washington's fire control procedures, linking radar operators directly to gun directors, and cutting out layers of communication delay. He had drilled his crew relentlessly until every man aboard could fight as one machine. Now he would finally have the chance to prove what he believed, that radar had made the battleship deadly again. The force assembled for the mission was called Task Force 64. It was small. Washington and South Dakota, escorted by 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. On paper, it looked formidable, 2 of America's newest battleships backed by fast, modern destroyers. In reality, it was a scratch group hastily thrown together. South Dakota had just returned from repair after being damaged at Santa Cruz. Many of her crew were new, some barely out of training. The destroyers came from different task groups. They had never operated together. There was no time for coordination, no time for rehearsals. Worse still, Washington and South Dakota used different radio systems. They literally could not talk to each other on the same frequencies. Recognition signals were mismatched, communications unreliable. Lee had to improvise a plan on the fly, relying on signal lights and prearranged maneuvers to keep his ships in formation. It was far from ideal, but war rarely waits for perfection. On the evening of November 14, as the sun dipped below the Solomon horizon, Task Force 64 steamed west toward Iron Bottom Sound. The 4 destroyers led the way, followed by the 2 great battleships, Washington in the lead, South Dakota behind. The column stretched more than 2 miles across the black water. They passed the ghostly remains of Callahan's battle, the twisted wrecks of cruisers and destroyers still visible at low tide. The sea still smelled of oil and death. Every man aboard knew what had happened there, and every man understood what might happen again. But this time, something was different. This time, they had radar, and a commander who knew exactly how to use it. That night, as Washington's radars began to pick up the first faint echoes of Admiral Condo's approaching fleet, the future of Guadalcanal, and perhaps of naval warfare itself, hung in the balance. The doctrine that said battleships were finished was about to meet its reckoning, and in the darkness ahead, Admiral Lee was ready to prove that the old gods of steel and fire still had one last fight left in them. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. was not the kind of man Hollywood would have cast as a hero. He didn't look the part. He was short, round-faced, with thick glasses and a quiet, deliberate way of speaking that made him seem more like a math professor than a warrior. But behind that mild exterior was a mind built for precision, calculation, and battle. Born in 1,888 inches, Natley, Kentucky, Lee had grown up in a small-town world of hunters and farmhands. He loved the feel of a rifle, the mathematics of aim, the silent challenge of distance. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1908, ranked near the top of his class, and quickly earned a reputation for one thing. He never missed. By the end of World War I, Lee was already considered one of the best marksmen in the Navy. 2 years later, at the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, He proved it beyond doubt, winning 5 gold medals, 2 silvers, and 1 bronze in shooting events. Those who watched him said his focus was absolute. Once he took aim, everything else vanished: the crowd, the noise, even time itself. To Willis Lee, the art of marksmanship wasn't about the weapon. It was about understanding motion, wind, gravity, velocity, timing. And when he later turned his attention to naval gunnery, he carried those same instincts with him. A 16-inch naval rifle, he liked to say, was simply a very large rifle with a very distant target. The principles were identical: calculate the lead, correct for motion, and fire until the math is perfect. But Lee's genius went far beyond personal skill. He was one of the few senior officers in the 1,930 who grasped what new technology, especially radar, could do for naval warfare. To most admirals, radar was a gadget, an aid for spotting planes or navigating in fog. To Lee, it was a revolution, one that could turn night into day and make human eyesight irrelevant. He understood early that the war at sea would be decided not just by firepower, but by information who could see first, aim first, and hit first. Radar was the key to all three. When the SG surface search radar and the Mark III fire control radar were installed on USS Washington, Lee saw possibilities others ignored. The SG could detect ships over 20 miles away, farther than the human eye could ever see, even in daylight. The Mark III could track targets and feed that data directly into the Mark VIII fire control computer, calculating range, bearing, and rate of movement in real time. But technology alone meant nothing if the crew couldn't use it under fire. So Lee transformed Washington into a floating laboratory, a ship-sized classroom where he and his men rewrote the rules of naval gunnery. He tore apart the Navy's traditional fire control system, a slow, layered process full of delays. Normally, radar data went from the operator to a talker, from the talker to the gunnery officer, from the gunnery officer to the turret captains. Every step added seconds. In night combat, seconde meant death. Lee changed that. He rewired Washington's internal communications so that the radar operators were connected directly to the gunnery director and plotting room. There were no intermediaries, no wasted time. When the radar plot officer called out target bearing 048, range 18,000, the big guns could already be swinging into position. He created a closed loop between the radar, the fire control computer, and the guns themselves. The radar tracked the target, the computer calculated lead and elevation, the guns fired. Then the radar tracked the fall of the shells and sent corrections instantly. It was the first real-time digital feedback system in naval combat, decades before computers would make such systems standard. Washington could now do something no other battleship in the Pacific could: fight blind and still hit. Lee didn't stop at hardware. He understood that the human element mattered just as much. He drilled his crew mercilessly but with purpose. He ran gunnery exercises in pitch darkness, forcing radar teams to find and track friendly ships at range. He simulated confusion, electronic interference, and communications breakdowns. He made every sailor learn the rhythm of battle through instruments, not through sight. "Your eyes will lie to you," he told them. "The radar won't." Men grumbled at first. Radar was new, untrusted, sometimes unreliable. But Lee was patient. He explained the logic behind every drill, every wire, every signal. Slowly, his crew began to see what he saw: that radar could remove the chaos from combat, that precision could replace panic. By mid-1942, Washington's radar teams could detect, track, and engage targets faster than any other ship in the fleet. Lee's system was elegant, simple, and brutally efficient, but it had never been tested in combat. No one knew how it would perform when the guns were firing for real. That test was coming. sooner than anyone expected. When Task Force 64 assembled at Espiritu Santo, the mood was tense. The men knew they were being sent into the most dangerous waters in the Pacific Iron-Bottom Sound, named for the wrecks that already littered its floor. The last American fleet to sail there had been annihilated. The destroyers assigned to Lee Walkie, Benham, Preston and Gwynn were veterans of earlier actions, fast and agile but lightly armoured. Their job was to screen the battleships from torpedoes and, if possible, launch their own. Everyone knew it was a near-suicidal assignment. Washington and South Dakota formed the core of the force, two giants of steel and armour, each capable of annihilating any ship afloat. But they had never fought together before. They were strangers. And to make things worse, they couldn't talk to each other properly. Washington's communications suite was incompatible with South Dakota's. Their radio frequencies didn't match. Recognition signals were different. Even the emergency light codes were out of sync. Lee discovered this only after the ships were already underway. It was a nightmare for coordination, two battleships sailing into combat, unable to communicate except by flashing lights and prearranged signals. Lee didn't complain. He adapted. He issued simple, unambiguous orders. Maintain column formation. Follow Washington's lead. Hold fire until ordered. As Task Force 64 moved south toward Guadalcanal, Lee gathered his senior officers in Washington's plotting room for one final briefing. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, his Kentucky drawl steady and unhurried. "We will have radar advantage," he told them. "They will not see us until we choose to be seen. Use that advantage. Do not waste it. Fire only when we have the range and bearing confirmed. Once we do not stop until they're gone." There was no grand speech, no dramatics. Lee wasn't that kind of man, but his officers left the room knowing exactly what was expected. Precision, discipline, patience. This was how he had lived his entire life. Whether it was a rifle at 1,000 yards or a 16-inch gun at 20 miles, Lee believed in one rule above all others: make the first shot count. The Japanese, meanwhile, were preparing too. Admiral Nobutake Kondo's fleet, the battleship Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, the light cruisers Sendai and Nagara, and 9 destroyers was moving south from the Shortland Islands. They were experienced, confident, and deadly. The Japanese Navy had spent 20 years perfecting night-fighting tactics, and their crews were masters of the art. Their lookouts could spot ship silhouettes at unbelievable distances. Their gunnery officers could aim by instinct in near darkness. And their secret weapon, the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, could reach targets 12 miles away at nearly 50 knots, each carrying a warhead big enough to shatter a cruiser. Every engagement so far in the war had proved the same thing. In the dark, the Japanese dominated. But this time, they would face something new, a ship that didn't need to see them at all. As dusk fell on the 14th of November 1942, the ships of Task Force 64 slipped silently past Savo Island. The destroyers led in column, followed by Washington and South Dakota. The sea was calm, the air was heavy. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Kondo's fleet was closing in, unaware that their every movement was being watched by invisible eyes. On the radar screens, the first faint echoes appeared distant, steady, deliberate. They were coming. In the Combat Information Center, operators adjusted dials, fine-tuned frequencies, and called out bearings. Data streamed to the plotting boards. Washington's mechanical brain, the Mark 8 computer, began to hum as it digested the information. In that dark room of glowing lights and whispered voices, Willis Lee's vision came alive. Radar had turned the invisible into the visible. The night no longer belonged to the Japanese. For the first time in naval history, an American admiral would fight a major surface battle, not with his eyes, but with his instruments. and as the Japanese ships crept closer, still blind, still confident, Lee prepared to unleash the storm he had spent his entire career building. The revolution he had predicted, the age of blind fighting, was about to begin. Within hours, the seas around Guadalcanal would explode with gunfire. And in that chaos, Lee's theories would either prove true or die with him and his men. But he was ready. He had waited his entire life for this test, a battle where precision, technology, and discipline could rewrite everything the world thought it knew about war at sea. The radar pings continued their rhythm, faster now. The contacts were closing. In the heart of the darkness, USS Washington glided forward, silent, unseen, unstoppable, her guns ready, her radar watching. The night would soon belong not to the Japanese, but to Willis A. Lee. The night of the 14th of November 1942 fell heavy over the Solomon Islands. The stars vanished behind thick clouds, the moon hidden completely. To the sailors of Task Force 64, it felt as though the ocean itself had gone silent, waiting. The 6 American ships moved through the darkness in single file, 4 destroyers in the lead, followed by 2 battleships. USS Walker led the line, then Benham, Preston, and Gwynn, followed by the massive silhouettes of USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Their wake glowed faintly in the black water, 6 thin ribbons of white vanishing into the night. The column stretched nearly 2 miles. Every man aboard knew what waters they were entering, a graveyard of ships and men. The sailors called it Iron Bottom Sound because so many hulls already rested on its floor, cruisers, destroyers, and transports from both sides, their twisted shapes lying silently beneath the waves. Only 3 nights earlier, those same waters had been a slaughterhouse. Admiral Daniel Callahan's cruiser force had been torn apart in close-range combat against Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima. The Americans had fought bravely, blindly, and died in droves. Their burned wrecks still floated in the current. Oil slicks spread across the surface like black mirrors. Bodies drifted among the debris. As Washington passed the site of the earlier battle, searchlights were dark, but the smell of burned metal and fuel lingered. Many aboard whispered silent prayers for the men who had gone down there, comrades they'd never met but whose fate they might soon share. In Washington's Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was electric. Radar operators bent over their glowing screens, eyes straining against the faint static snow. Every sweep of the SG radar antenna revealed new blips, mountains on Guadalcanal's coast, friendly aircraft returning to Henderson Field, the faint echo of Savo Island to starboard. Then, at 22:52, a sharp new contact appeared. Range, 0 yards. Bearing, 295 degrees. More contacts followed, 9 in total. The enemy was coming. Multiple surface targets, bearing steady, speed 20 knots, the radar officer reported. Admiral Willis A. Lee Jr., standing calmly beside the radar plot, adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the display. The Japanese were moving in a long line, their vanguard of destroyers sweeping ahead, followed by heavier ships, cruisers, and a battleship. It was Admiral Nobutake Kondo's force, precisely as intelligence had warned. To Lee, the radar image was as clear as daylight. He could read their formation, their course, even their spacing. The Japanese, meanwhile, saw nothing. They were still fighting the old way, relying on human eyes, hoping to spot silhouettes or muzzle flashes in the dark. They had no idea that an American battleship was already tracking them with invisible precision. This was the advantage Lee had trained for, the ability to see without being seen. He faced a crucial decision. He could strike immediately, open fire at maximum range, and hammer the enemy before they even knew he was there. Washington's 16-inch guns could easily reach them. The radar fire control could calculate exact bearing and elevation even in total darkness. But Lee hesitated. He understood the larger picture. If he fired too soon, Admiral Kondo might realize he was facing a powerful American force and retreat before committing his ships to the bombardment of Henderson Field. The mission was not just to destroy enemy ships, it was to stop that bombardment once and for all. If Kondo escaped into the night, the Japanese might return the next evening to finish what they started. The Marines on Guadalcanal could not survive another night of shellfire, so Lee made his choice. Wait. He would let the Japanese come closer, close enough that they could not turn back, close enough that retreat would be impossible. Then he would strike with the full fury of Washington's guns. It was a dangerous gamble. The closer the Japanese came, the greater the risk that their lookouts would spot the American formation first. If they fired their long-lance torpedoes before Lee gave the order, the entire task force could be wiped out in minutes. But Lee trusted his radar. And he trusted his crew. Minute by minute, the range closed. Onalte, 0 yards. Iwan Seaton. Iwan Launten. The Japanese line continued forward, unaware. Their lookouts scanned the black horizon toward Guadalcanal, expecting aircraft or PT boats, not American battleships. They were preparing for their bombardment run, not a fight. Aboard Washington, the only sounds were the hum of turbines, the clicking of radar scopes, and the whispered reports from the CIC. Men spoke in low voices, as if afraid that sound itself might betray them. Target group bearing steady. Range 10,000 yards. Still closing. 10,000 yards, 5 nautical miles. At this distance, the Japanese should have seen the dark silhouettes of the battleships ahead. But the Americans were positioned against the black outline of Savo Island, invisible to the naked eye. Lee's instinct told him the moment was almost right. He waited, just a little longer. 9,000 yards, 8,000. Now they were inside torpedo range. If the Japanese launched now, Washington and South Dakota might never survive, but Lee still held his fire. He wanted them completely committed, too close to turn away. The tension on Washington's bridge was suffocating. Officers stood frozen at their stations, every muscle tight. The gunnery teams waited at their posts, hands hovering over firing switches. Lee raised his binoculars but saw only darkness. He didn't need to see. His radar saw for him. At exactly 23 hours, he gave the order he had been holding back for so long. Open fire. The effect was apocalyptic. 9 16-inch guns erupted from Washington's triple turrets, hurling 24,300 pounds of steel into the night. The concussion shook the ship from bow to stern. Men on deck felt the shockwave in their chests. The muzzle flashes lit the sea like lightning. The shells soared across the dark sky, invisible to the naked eye but perfectly tracked by radar. 23 seconds later, the ocean ahead erupted in giant white columns around the Japanese light cruiser Sendai, the first target of the war's first radar-directed battleship salvo. The first volley missed, but only barely. Sendai was drenched in seawater as towering geysers rose beside her. Her captain, startled by explosions he could not explain, ordered a hard turn and laid smoke. He still had no idea where the enemy fire was coming from. Lee didn't pause. The radar operators fed new data to the plotting room. The Mark 8 computer-adjusted range and bearing. Shift target destroyer in the van, Lee ordered. The second salvo roared out. This time Washington's guns found their mark. The shells struck the Japanese destroyer Ayanami, leading the column. 1 16-inch shell, perhaps 2, hit her amidships. The effect was catastrophic. The thinly armoured destroyer was torn apart. Her boilers exploded. Her engine room vanished in flame. Ayanami stopped dead in the water, burning from stem to stern. Her crew fought desperately, but the ship was finished. Washington's opening shots had turned the darkness into chaos. Within moments, the Japanese reacted. Searchlights stabbed through the blackness, torpedoes streaked into the sea, and the quiet night became a maelstrom of noise and flame. The American destroyers surged forward, guns flashing, launching their own torpedoes. South Dakota opened fire, her 16-inch guns roaring into the storm. But the Japanese still didn't know how many American ships they faced. In the confusion, they fired at everything, flares, smoke, and even their own shadows. For Washington's crew, the battle felt both unreal and immediate. They could not see their enemy, but they could feel him. The radar screens glowed with movement blips darting, crossing, fading. Orders flew back and forth. Target shifting, bearing 340, range 9,000. That, every shot was guided by the invisible mathematics of the radar beam. For the first time in naval history, a battleship was fighting completely blind and winning. On the Japanese side, panic spread. The sea exploded with gunfire. Searchlights swept back and forth, seeking targets that weren't there. Star shells burst overhead, flooding the ocean with pale light. But still, the Americans remained ghosts. In that first thunderous exchange, the balance of the Pacific War had shifted. The Japanese had mastered night fighting with the human eye. The Americans had just mastered it with technology. And at the center of it all stood Admiral Willis A, calm and focused amid the storm, watching his radar plot unfold like a chessboard. He had waited his entire career for this night, a battle where precision and innovation would finally prove stronger than doctrine and tradition. The battle was only beginning, and it was about to become the most violent surface action of the entire Pacific War. But for now, Washington had drawn first blood unseen, unstoppable, and utterly lethal. The night belonged no longer to the Japanese, but to the radar eyes of the United States Navy. For a few precious minutes after Washington's first salvo, the night belonged entirely to Admiral Willis A. Radar-guided gunfire had struck like a thunderbolt from the void. The Japanese formation reeled in confusion. Their lead destroyer, Ayanami, was a burning wreck, dead in the water. The cruiser Sendai staggered under near misses so violent they buckled her hull plating. But the calm precision of those opening moments would not last. The sea around Iron Bottom Sound was about to erupt into a nightmare, a furious brawl of flashes, fire, and death where visibility meant nothing and survival depended on instinct. At 23:2, the Japanese finally reacted. Searchlights stabbed out from the darkness, white beams sweeping the sea, seeking the phantom that had struck them. Star shells burst overhead, bathing the ocean in ghastly, ghostly light. The eerie glow illuminated the American destroyers surging forward at full speed. Lee's 4 escorts, Walkie, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn, were charging into the maelstrom, small and fragile compared to the giants behind them. Their captains knew their mission: get close enough to launch torpedoes and draw fire away from the battleships. It was suicidal work, but they went anyway. As they raced ahead, their 5-inch guns cracked rapid fire, their torpedo crews working frantically in the blinding flashes. The Japanese destroyers answered with their own weapons, the feared Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, each a silver streak of death moving at nearly 50 knots. The ocean was suddenly alive with invisible killers, hundreds of torpedoes weaving through the black water. From Washington's bridge, Admiral Lee could see the whole battle unfold on his radar plot, a mess of overlapping echoes, dozens of ships crossing paths, some friend, some foe. It looked like chaos. And it was. In the confusion, South Dakota, following 800 yards astern of Washington, suddenly disappeared from the radar screen. At first, the operators thought it was interference. Then, reports came from below decks. Massive electrical failure. The heart of one of America's most powerful battleships had gone dark. The failure began with something trivial. In South Dakota's main electrical switchboard, a technician tried to correct a minor grounding issue. In his haste, he threw the wrong circuit breakers. Instantly, every main electrical line in the ship tripped offline. Within seconds, her lights went out, her radars went black, and her gun directors froze. Even the intercoms died. The 35,000-ton battleship, a masterpiece of modern engineering, was suddenly blind, deaf, and half-paralyzed. Emergency generators kicked in, but they could power only a few systems. Without radar, the gunnery officers had no way to track targets. Without power to the director towers, the big guns could only fire manually, local control, as the Navy called it. The precision that made a battleship lethal was gone. To the Japanese, South Dakota had become a glowing, motionless target. The moment the lights flickered back on, they gave her away. Searchlights from Kirishima, Otago, and Takao locked onto her, crossing beams of white brilliance that turned the sea into daylight. Dozens of enemy guns zeroed in, the air filled with the howl of shells. 14-inch rounds from Kirishima's main battery thundered across the water, followed by 8-inch shells from the heavy cruisers. They hit South Dakota's superstructure like sledgehammers. The first impacts shattered her radar antenna. The next blew holes through her upper decks, knocking out secondary guns. Fragments tore through crew stations, radio rooms, and ammunition hoists. The ship shook violently with every hit. Splinters ripped through bulkheads like machine gun fire. Fires broke out across the upper levels. In the chaos, Captain Thomas Gatch, South Dakota's commanding officer, was wounded by shrapnel but refused to leave the bridge. His crew kept fighting, firing blind into the light. In just 90 seconds, South Dakota took 27 hits, heavy shells, medium shells, and countless smaller rounds. Her once pristine superstructure was riddled with holes. Antennas hung twisted and sparking. Her secondary batteries were destroyed. Dozens were killed or wounded. The air reeked of burning paint, hot steel, and cordite. But through it all, the ship stayed afloat. Her armor held. The great plates of her hull had been built for punishment, and they refused to yield. Ahead of her, Washington kept firing, her radars still locked, her guns still under perfect control. But Lee could see the disaster unfolding astern. His second battleship was crippled and drawing every Japanese gun like a magnet. Then came worse news. The destroyer line, the thin shield protecting his flanks, was being annihilated. USS Preston, third in line, was the first to die. Caught in a crossfire between Japanese cruisers and destroyers, she took multiple hits within seconds. One shell struck her bridge, killing her captain instantly. Another exploded in her engine room. Fires engulfed the ship. Ammunition began to cook off. "Abandon ship!" came the order, but it was too late. As the crew scrambled for the rails, Preston's magazines detonated. A fireball rose into the sky, and the ship vanished in a sheet of flame. Out of 250 men, 117 were lost. Ahead of her, USS Washington, the lead destroyer, met a similar fate. She had pressed closest to the Japanese formation, firing until her guns overheated. She managed to launch a spread of torpedoes, perhaps the only American torpedoes that night to reach the enemy, but before she could turn away, Japanese shells found her. One hit the bridge, killing her commander. Another tore open her forward magazines. Then a long-lance torpedo slammed into her side amidships. Walker split in half. She sank in minutes, her bow rising briefly before slipping beneath the surface. 175 men went down with her. Benham, next in line, was struck by another long lance that blew off her entire bow. Somehow she stayed afloat, her crew sealing bulkheads and fighting fires, but she could no longer steer or fight. Gwyn, the last destroyer, was hit multiple times and set ablaze, but her engines still worked. Her captain, seeing the carnage ahead, made the heartbreaking decision to retreat, stopping only to pull survivors from the oily water. Within 15 minutes, Admiral Lee's destroyer screen was gone, 3 ships sunk or crippled, hundreds of men lost. The path to Washington was now wide open. By 23:15, Lee's situation was desperate. Of 6 ships that had entered Iron-Bottom Sound, 5 were gone or damaged. South Dakota was burning and blind. The destroyers were sinking. Every piece of naval doctrine, every tactical manual, every logical instinct said the same thing: withdraw immediately. He was outnumbered at least 14-1. He was facing a Japanese fleet that still included a battleship, 4 heavy cruisers, and several destroyers. Any other commander would have turned away, saved his ship, saved his men. But Willis A. Lee was not any other commander. He looked at the radar screen still alive, still clear, and saw what no one else could see. The Japanese formation had fallen apart. In their rush to destroy South Dakota and the American destroyers, they had scattered. Their ships were no longer coordinated, their battle line broken. Some were chasing burning wrecks, others were circling aimlessly, and none of them had noticed Washington. She was hidden behind the flaming remains of Preston and Walker, her radar signature masked by the debris and smoke. To the Japanese, she was invisible. Lee realized he had one chance, a single, perfect moment when he could strike back before they knew he was there. To seize it, he would have to do something that violated every principle of battleship warfare. Charge alone into an enemy fleet. He didn't hesitate. He gave the order quietly, almost casually. Silence on all circuits. No lights. No radio. Course 030. Full speed ahead. The bridge crew repeated it without question. The turbines rumbled, and the 35,000-ton battleship accelerated to 26 knots, slicing through the darkness toward the enemy. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady heartbeat of the engines and the rhythmic sweep of the radar. On the glowing green screens, the blips drew closer: the battleship Kirishima, the cruisers Atago and Takao, and their escorts. Washington was alone now, but not blind, not afraid. Admiral Lee stood calmly beside the radar console, his glasses reflecting the faint light. He had lost everything around him, but his vision, his belief in technology, training, and precision remained unbroken. He had turned a night of disaster into an opportunity. The Japanese thought they had won. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The battle that began in chaos was about to reach its climax, a duel between 2 battleships in the blackest night of the Pacific, one fighting with searchlights and instinct, the other guided by invisible eyes. The next few minutes would decide the fate of Guadalcanal and prove once and for all that the battleship was not yet obsolete. When South Dakota slipped out of view, battered and burning, and the last American destroyer turned away, USS Washington was suddenly alone, the last ship standing in a sea of fire. The Japanese guns roared from every direction. Searchlights cut through the blackness. Star shells burst overhead, painting the water in flickering white. To anyone watching from above, it would have looked like the end: a single battleship, isolated, surrounded by an entire enemy fleet. But in the radar-lit heart of Washington's Combat Information Center, the situation looked different. Admiral Willis A. Lee Jr. could see what the Japanese could not. Their ships, once in a tight, disciplined formation, were now scattered across Iron-Bottom Sound, like pieces on a broken chessboard. Some were chasing burning wrecks. Others were circling aimlessly. Their coordination, their greatest advantage, had collapsed. And none of them had noticed Washington. Lee understood that the Japanese believed the crippled South Dakota was the only battleship present. Their searchlights still followed her as she limped south, smoke trailing from her decks. Admiral Kondo, aboard the heavy cruiser Atago, was convinced his fleet had won the night. He did not yet know that another battleship, invisible, untouched, and deadly, was closing in from the north. On Washington's bridge, Lee studied the radar scope. Range, 15,000 yards to Kirishima, bearing steady. Kirishima was moving slowly, turning towards South Dakota to finish her off. Lee gave a quiet order. All hands maintain radar silence. No lights, no radio. Full speed ahead, course 030. The 35,000-ton battleship surged forward, accelerating to 26 knots, nearly her top speed. The sea boiled around her bow. Every man aboard knew what it meant. They were charging alone into a fleet that outnumbered them 14-1. At 23:58, Washington's radar operators began calling out ranges. Range to main target, 14,000 yards. Closing, 13,000, 12,000. The fire control teams made their final calculations. The Mark 8 analog computer, fed by the Mark 3 radar, adjusted lead angles and elevation automatically. Then, at 8,400 yards point-blank range for battleship guns, Lee gave the order. Open fire on the battleship. Commence firing. The night exploded. Washington's 9/16-inch divided by 45 caliber guns fired in perfect unison, 3 triple turrets belching flame and thunder. The entire ship convulsed from the recoil. Men's teeth rattled. The concussion shattered glass in compartments below decks. Each shell weighed 2,700 pounds, the mass of a small car traveling at over 2,300 feet per second. They crossed the dark water in less than 10 seconds. The first salvo straddled the target, Kirishima, giant columns of water erupting around her. The second salvo hit home. The results were devastating. One shell smashed through Kirishima's forward turret, killing the entire gun crew and blowing the roof off. Another struck amidships, ripping through her engine room and detonating deep inside the machinery spaces. A third plunged below the waterline, tearing open her hull. In just 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 16-inch shells and over 100 5-inch shells from her secondary batteries. At least 9 major hits, possibly as many as 20, tore Kirishima apart. The Japanese battleship shuddered under the blows. Flames rose from her deck. Her pagoda mast, the tall, tower-like bridge structure typical of Japanese ships, was shredded by shellfire. Her communications failed. Her steering jammed hard to port, sending her into a slow, helpless circle. Every attempt to return fire failed. Her gunners, blinded by smoke and light, fired wildly into the darkness, unaware of where their tormentor was. Their radar was primitive, almost useless. They could not see Washington. She was hidden in the dark, firing by radar guidance alone. In the control tower, Captain Iwabuchi Sanji, Kirishima's commanding officer, refused to abandon ship. Wounded and half-blinded by smoke, he shouted orders that no one could carry out. His ship was dying beneath him. Within minutes, Kirishima was burning from bow to stern. But Lee didn't stop there. Once Kirishima was crippled, he shifted targets. Washington's radar plot showed 2 heavy cruisers, Atago and Takao, to port, maneuvering to escape. Shift target to nearest cruiser, Lee ordered. The main battery traversed smoothly. A new firing solution appeared on the radar plot. Fire! The guns roared again. Salvos splashed around Atago, towering walls of water soaking her bridge. Shell fragments tore through her upper decks, forcing Admiral Kondo to order evasive maneuvers. At the same time, the Japanese cruisers launched a spread of 16 Type 93 torpedoes at Washington. But Washington's radar picked up the launch instantly. The fire control radar tracked the torpedo wakes like thin threads on the scope. Lee reacted immediately. Hard to starboard, increased to flank speed. The giant battleship heeled over sharply as her rudders turned. The torpedoes streaked past some missing by only yards, one running directly beneath her stern but failing to detonate. When the wakes faded, not a single torpedo had struck home. Washington had danced between them, untouched. By 0:15, the Japanese fleet was breaking apart. Admiral Kondo, now realizing the truth that a second American battleship was still fighting and that it was slaughtering his ships, ordered a full retreat. His cruisers and destroyers turned north, retreating under cover of smoke. But Kirishima could not move. Her steering was jammed, her hull ripped open, her boiler rooms flooded. She circled helplessly as fires raged across her decks. Her surviving crew fought desperately to save her, jettisoning ammunition, sealing compartments, pumping out water, but the list kept increasing. Washington continued to track her on radar. Lee could have finished her with a few more salvos, but he had a new concern. Friendly PT boats from Tulagi were heading into the area, under orders to attack any large ship sighted in the darkness. Without identification, they might mistake Washington for the enemy and fire torpedoes at her. Lee decided not to risk it. He ordered the guns to cease fire. Washington turned north at 25 knots, radar still scanning for threats. The battle had lasted less than 40 minutes. In that time, Admiral Lee's single ship had destroyed a Japanese battleship, crippled 2 heavy cruisers, and driven off one of the most powerful surface fleets Japan had ever assembled. The cost: not one man killed aboard Washington, not one serious wound. The only damage was a single 5-inch shell from South Dakota, a friendly shot fired by mistake in the chaos that had cut Washington's radio antenna. It was the most lopsided surface victory of the Pacific War. Behind her, Kirishima continued to burn. Captain Iwabuchi gathered the survivors on the slanting deck. He knew the ship could not be saved. The list was past 30 degrees. The fires were uncontrollable. At 1, he gave the final order: abandon ship. The crew assembled, sang the Japanese national anthem, and gave 3 banzai cheers for the emperor. Then they went over the side into the oily water. At 3:20, Kirishima rolled onto her beam ends and slipped beneath the waves northwest of Savo Island, taking over 300 men with her. She was the first Japanese battleship sunk by another battleship in the Pacific War, and she had fallen to a single ship, fighting alone, guided by the unseen hand of radar. When dawn came on November 15, the sun rose over a transformed battlefield. Wreckage and oil fires dotted the surface of Iron Bottom Sound. The sea was littered with debris lifeboats, bodies, drifting fuel slicks. To the south, South Dakota limped away, her decks scarred but her crew still alive. To the north, Washington steamed intact, her guns blackened from firing but her hull untouched. Out beyond the horizon, Japanese transports that had been waiting to unload reinforcements for Guadalcanal were now sitting helplessly in open water exposed. As daylight spread, aircraft from Henderson Field swooped in. American dive bombers and torpedo planes struck relentlessly. 7 transports were sunk. The remaining 4 beached themselves in desperation, their cargo of 11,000 Japanese soldiers trapped without food or supplies. Guadalcanal would not fall. The Americans had held, and it was Washington's victory that made it possible. That night, technology had defeated tradition. Radar had defeated eyesight. And one man's conviction that information, precision, and calm under pressure could outweigh any numerical advantage had been proven true. Admiral Lee had done what no one thought possible. He had taken a single battleship into the heart of an enemy fleet and destroyed it. The Japanese Navy, once invincible in night combat, would never again send its capital ships into those waters. Iron Bottom Sound had claimed many ships, but that night it became the proving ground of the future. In the words of one sailor aboard Washington, written in his diary that morning, "We fought in the dark, but we saw everything. They fought in the light and saw nothing. The battle was over. The Marines on Guadalcanal would live to fight another day. And the myth of Japanese night-fighting supremacy had been shattered forever by a single battleship, a single admiral, and a machine that could see through darkness. When the guns finally fell silent over Iron Bottom Sound, the sea itself seemed to tremble. The air stank of oil, smoke, and cordite. The black surface was dotted with fire fragments of ships still burning, ammunition still cooking off, oil slicks shimmering with the reflection of a rising moon. And yet, amid all that destruction, one giant silhouette moved through the darkness, calm, steady, undefeated. It was USS Washington. Her great hull was untouched, her engines still humming perfectly, her guns still ready to fire. Around her, the wreckage of war drifted silently. Broken timbers, empty life rafts, flashes of flame. She had entered the night as one of 6 American ships. She was leaving it as the only one still able to fight. For the men aboard, there was no cheering, no celebration, only exhaustion and disbelief. They had fired until their gun barrels glowed red. They had felt the ship lurch with each salvo, had watched radar blips vanish from the screens, had heard the chaos of dying ships over the radio. And now, there was only silence. At one, far to the south, the Japanese battleship Kirishima was mortally wounded, burning and slowly rolling to port. Her captain, Iwabuchi Sanji, had ordered the crew to abandon ship. As they gathered on her slanting decks, they sang the Japanese national anthem, shouted 3 banzai cheers for the emperor, and went over the side. At 3:20, Kirishima rolled completely and sank northwest of Savo Island, taking more than 300 men with her. The ocean that had already swallowed so many ships now claimed another, but this one was a battleship, destroyed by a single American vessel fighting alone. When dawn came on the 15th of November 1942, the scale of the victory became clear. The Japanese bombardment mission, the entire reason for Kondo's fleet to be there, had failed. Henderson Field, the lifeline of the Marines on Guadalcanal, was still intact. Its runways were pitted and cratered, but functional. American aircraft would fly again that morning. But the Japanese weren't finished. Offshore, a fleet of 11 troop transports was waiting, carrying nearly 11,000 soldiers, their mission to reinforce and resupply the battered Japanese garrison on the island. Kondo's surface fleet had been meant to clear the way for them. Now, his battleship was gone, his cruisers damaged, and his escorts scattered. As the sun climbed higher, aircraft from Henderson Field took to the skies Marine dive bombers, Navy TBF Avengers, and Army Air Force B-17 seconds. They found the transports easily. What followed was a massacre. One by one, the transports were hit, burning and sinking under the relentless air assault. Some tried to beach themselves on Guadalcanal's coast, hoping to unload what they could. Others exploded offshore. By afternoon, 7 transports were gone. Only 4 managed to reach the beaches, and even those were wrecked by air attacks before nightfall. Barely 4,000 Japanese troops made it to shore, and they arrived without most of their food, ammunition, or equipment. They would fight bravely for months, but the battle for Guadalcanal was effectively lost. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. For Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the news from Guadalcanal was almost unbelievable. 2 battleships, 4 destroyers against a superior enemy fleet, and somehow they had won. The message from Admiral William F. Halsey arrived first, short and emotional. You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history. But the glory came at a cost. 3 American destroyers, Walker, Preston, and Benham, were gone. Gwynn was crippled. South Dakota had taken 27 hits, suffered 38 dead and 59 wounded, and was so damaged she would need months of repair. More than 400 Americans were dead. But compared to the magnitude of what had been achieved stopping the Japanese fleet, saving Guadalcanal, preserving the first U.S. offensive of the war. Those losses, though tragic, had not been in vain. And Washington? She had come through, untouched. When the damage reports came in, no one could quite believe them. In the fiercest surface battle of the entire Pacific campaign, fought at night, at point-blank range, against overwhelming odds, USS Washington had suffered no combat casualties. Not one sailor killed. Not one seriously wounded. The ship herself had taken only a single hit, a stray 5-inch shell that cut her radio antenna. It was a statistic so improbable that other commanders initially thought it was a clerical error, but it was true. Washington had delivered the most destructive blow of the battle, while emerging almost completely unscathed. That morning, as Washington steamed towards safety at high speed, her crew began to understand what they had accomplished. They had fought an entire enemy fleet in total darkness. They had used a technology that most of the Navy still treated as experimental. They had turned radar, a set of dials, wires, and glowing screens, into a weapon more powerful than any torpedo or shell. And they had done it without losing a single man. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz studied the after-action reports carefully. He realized what this battle represented: the first true test of radar-directed gunnery in combat, and proof that it could decide the outcome of a major engagement. For the first time, a battleship had fought and won a complete surface battle without ever visually sighting its main target. It was the beginning of a revolution in naval warfare, but not everyone saw it that way. Within the Navy's hierarchy, the carrier admirals still ruled. To them, the victory at Guadalcanal was important but not transformative. They labeled it a defensive success, a necessary holding action, not the revolutionary breakthrough it truly was. Lee's meticulous after-action report, which highlighted radar as the decisive factor, was quietly filed away. His recommendations for new tactics, new training, and new integration of radar with gunnery were acknowledged, but not acted upon. The Navy was already moving on to new battles, new campaigns, and the expanding dominance of carrier warfare. The lesson of Washington's victory was too inconvenient, too disruptive to doctrine. But for those who had been there, no explanation was needed. The men of Washington knew what they had seen and what they had done. They had stood alone against 14 ships and survived. They had watched radar blips vanish as their shells found their marks. They had proven that courage, discipline, and innovation could overcome overwhelming numbers. In the mess decks and gunnery stations, sailors began telling each other the same thing. We weren't fighting blind, we were fighting first. It was the truth. The Japanese Navy had trained for 20 years to master night fighting. The Americans had mastered something newer, something unseen. That night, the advantage of human vision died, and the age of electronic eyes began. In the weeks that followed, Washington limped briefly to Noumea, New Caledonia, for resupply and minor repairs. Her crew was granted short liberty, their first rest since the ordeal. When they came ashore, they were heroes. Other sailors treated them with awe, as if they had survived the impossible. But Washington's men didn't boast. They knew their victory had been born of necessity, not glory. They had seen too much destruction, too many ships burning, too many friends lost in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. They knew that luck had played its part, and that the next battle might not be so merciful. Still, every man aboard carried a quiet pride. They had proven that the battleship, properly used, properly trained, properly equipped, could still dominate the sea. They had saved Guadalcanal. They had saved the Marines on Henderson Field. And they had done it without losing one of their own. By the time Washington returned to service weeks later, Guadalcanal was secure. The Japanese army, starving and cut off, began its long retreat. The great offensive momentum of the Japanese Empire had been broken forever. The Pacific War would grind on for 3 more years, but after that night, its outcome was no longer in doubt. The Americans had found their footing, their technology worked, their tactics worked, and they had men like Willis A. Lee and the crew of USS Washington who could turn technology into victory. In every sense, that night was a turning point. The battleship that had been dismissed as obsolete had proved its worth. The admiral who had been underestimated for his quiet demeanor had reshaped naval warfare. And the radar, that strange, flickering green light, had shown the world what the future of combat would look like. As one historian later wrote, "In Iron Bottom Sound, the age of the battleship ended, but not before one battleship proved it could still rule the sea." In the weeks after the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, victory reports poured into fleet headquarters. Dispatches hailed the courage of the crews, the valor of the Marines, and the endurance of every man who had fought for that haunted island. But amid the congratulations, one name was curiously muted: USS Washington. She had done the impossible. She had destroyed a Japanese battleship in the blackest night of the Pacific, routed an enemy fleet, and saved Guadalcanal. And yet, her triumph was quietly labelled a defensive success. To those who understood what had happened, it was far more than that. It was a revolution. Admiral William F. Halsey knew the truth. He sent a personal message to Washington's commander, Admiral Willis A. Lee, Jr., praising him in words few admirals ever received. "You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history." But the official Navy communiques were restrained, even dismissive. They called the engagement a night action supporting the defense of Guadalcanal. No mention of the technological leap that had occurred. No acknowledgement that radar, not luck, had won the battle. To the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., the victory didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. The Navy's future lay with aircraft carriers, not battleships. And admitting that a battleship armed with guns, not planes, had single-handedly turned the tide of the Pacific was an embarrassment to doctrine. So the reports were filed away, the photographs were archived, and the battle that should have rewritten naval tactics was quietly forgotten. Admiral Lee did not complain. He was not a man of vanity. When a junior officer asked him if it bothered him that the battle wasn't receiving the attention it deserved, he smiled faintly and said, "The important thing isn't credit. The important thing is results." Guadalcanal was saved. The Marines were alive. That was enough. But privately, Lee was disappointed. He had seen firsthand what technology could do, how radar, properly used, could make darkness irrelevant and fear meaningless. He wrote detailed after-action reports describing every radar contact, every firing solution, every adjustment made in those frantic 40 minutes. He outlined new training programs for radar operators, new gunnery doctrines, and new fleet coordination methods. He sent them up the chain of command. Most of them were ignored. The Navy was moving on. Carrier victories, Coral Sea, Midway, Santa Cruz had already captured the public's imagination. Battleships were now described as floating AA platforms, their primary purpose to guard the carriers. Lee's victory at Guadalcanal was treated as an anomaly, a relic of a fading era. Few wanted to see it as the dawn of a new one. It was a painful irony. The very technology Lee had pioneered, the integration of radar, computers, and gunnery, would become the foundation of modern naval warfare. But in 1942, it was dismissed as a curiosity. The institution could not see the future, even when it was glowing green on a radar screen. Washington, meanwhile, returned to war. She fought at the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She earned 13 battle stars, more than almost any other battleship in the Pacific. But she never again faced an enemy ship in surface combat. The Navy kept her tied to the carriers, using her vast firepower for anti-aircraft protection and shore bombardment. Her 16-inch guns thundered across beaches, pulverizing fortifications, but she would never again duel another battleship. The ship that had proven what radar could do was never allowed to do it again. For Admiral Lee, the war became an endless frustration of missed opportunities. By 1944, he commanded the fast battleship force, a powerful formation of 6 modern warships. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, those ships could have intercepted the Japanese surface fleet and destroyed it. But doctrine prevailed. Lee's battleships were ordered to stay behind the carriers. At Leyte Gulf, Halsey took the battleships on a fruitless chase after Japanese carriers, leaving the invasion fleet at risk. The result was the desperate Battle off Samar, where small escort carriers and destroyers fought heroically against impossible odds. Lee knew his battleships could have saved them. He had proved what a single battleship could do at Guadalcanal, but orders were orders. He obeyed, but the frustration never left him. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Admiral Lee finally returned home. He was promoted to Vice Admiral and given command of the Atlantic Fleet battleships, stationed off the coast of Maine. He was 57 years old, still sharp, still working on new tactical papers about radar integration and surface warfare. Then, on the 25th of August 1945, just 10 days after the war ended, tragedy struck. While being ferried to his flagship, the training battleship USS Wyoming, Lee suffered a sudden heart attack aboard a small motor launch. His crew tried desperately to revive him, but it was too late. The man who had changed naval warfare died quietly at sea. Admiral Nimitz called him one of the finest officers I have ever known. Admiral Halsey said, "Lee's tactical genius saved countless American lives." His sailors mourned deeply. Many wept openly when they heard the news. But when the New York Times ran his obituary, it devoted only one line to his greatest achievement. He commanded the battleship Washington at Guadalcanal. That was all. The battle that had saved the Pacific was barely mentioned. USS Washington herself lived a little longer. After the war, she carried returning soldiers home as part of Operation Magic Carpet. Then, on the 27th of June 1947, she was decommissioned and placed in the reserve fleet at the New York Navy Yard. There she sat for 14 years, rusting slowly, visited occasionally by curious officers, ignored by history. On the 1st of June 1960, she was struck from the Naval Register. A year later, on the 24th of May 1961, she was sold for scrap to the Lipset division of the Luria Brothers Company for $544,000. She was towed to New Jersey and cut apart. No museum, no memorial. The battleship that had saved Guadalcanal was melted down into razor blades and reinforcing bars. But history has a way of keeping the truth alive, even when institutions forget. The systems Lee and Washington pioneered, radar-directed fire control, sensor integration, centralized data processing, would evolve into the heart of modern naval combat. Today, every American destroyer and cruiser equipped with the Aegis combat system operates on principles first tested by Washington that night in 1942. The idea that sensors, computers, and weapons could work together as a single, seamless system that was Lee's vision. He had proven it in blood and darkness, long before anyone else believed it was possible. There is another truth, quieter but just as remarkable. Throughout her entire combat career, 13 major operations across 2 oceans, USS Washington never lost a single crew member to enemy action. Not one. No other capital ship in any navy can make that claim. Her survival was not luck. It was discipline. It was design. It was the tactical genius of a man who understood that the best defense was to strike first, unseen, with perfect precision. In battle after battle, Washington fought smarter, not just harder, and because of that, her men lived. Today, few remember her. Tourists visit the USS Missouri, where the war ended, or the USS Arizona, where it began. But almost no one speaks of the ship that saved the first American offensive, the battleship that proved courage and technology could defeat tradition. Yet her legacy is everywhere. Every time a radar-guided missile locks onto a target, every time a combat computer fuses sensor data into a single tactical picture, every time a ship fights beyond visual range, the ghost of Washington is there. She was the first to fight that way, the first to show that in the chaos of war, information is power. 82 years later, her story still asks the same question of every generation that goes to sea. Will you cling to old doctrines, or will you trust innovation when it matters most? Will you fear change, or master it? Because in the end, that was the lesson of Washington and Willis Lee, that one ship, with the right leader and the right technology, can change the course of history. Their victory was forgotten by the admirals who couldn't understand it, but remembered by the sailors who lived it and by every warship that sails under radar-guided eyes today. If you ever find yourself standing on the shore of Iron Bottom Sound, where the water is still and the wind carries the smell of salt and oil, listen closely. Somewhere beneath those waves lie the bones of ships, Japanese and American alike, and among them, the echoes of that night. You may not see Washington's hull anymore, but you can still feel her presence in the quiet hum of every radar, the calm confidence of every ship that fights by data instead of sight. She proved that courage and innovation can win against impossible odds, and that truth, no matter how long forgotten, will always find its way home. These stories matter, Lee once said, not because they are history, but because they are truth. Story. And truth, like the men who fought that night, deserves to be remembered.